Out on the sun-scorched plains of 1880s Arizona, where memories of war were as fresh as the graves they filled, a lone Apache warrior had traded his lance for a plow. His name was Ethan, and for 20 years his only companions were the ghosts of his past and the wind that whispered their names. He had built a life of solitude, a fortress of silence. But the frontier is relentless. One blistering afternoon, the dust on the horizon wasn't a storm, but a harbinger of fate, a broken-down wagon carrying 5 desperate widows, their lives shattered by tragedy. They had nothing left but a single, impossible plea for shelter. This is the story of how that plea would either become their salvation or ignite the very flames of the past Ethan had fought so hard to escape. The silence of the Cinder Creek Ranch was a living thing. It was woven from the buzz of horseflies in the afternoon heat, the sigh of the wind through brittle sagebrush, and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling the mesas. For 20 years this silence had been the sole companion of the man they called Nate. To the few prospectors or lost cattlemen who stumbled upon his land, he was just a quiet, weathered man of indeterminate age. His face a roadmap of sun and sorrow who kept to himself. But his real name was Ethan. Ethan had once been a warrior with Geronimo's band. He had seen the world burn, had felt the fire of battle and the cold despair of surrender. He had lost his wife Alope and his young son Desoda, not to a soldier's bullet, but to the white man's coughing sickness in the squalor of the San Carlos reservation. When he had finally been granted this parcel of land, a dry, unforgiving tract nobody else wanted as part of a forgotten treaty clause, he had accepted it, not as a gift, but as a cage. He built his adobe house with his own hands, dug a well until he hit the life-giving waters of Cinder Creek, and turned his back on the world of men, both red and white. He was a ghost living on borrowed time in a land that had forgotten him. His days were a ritual of survival. He rose before the sun, his movements economical and precise. He tended his small herd of hardy longhorns, checked the fences, and worked his modest patch of corn and squash. His hands, which once held a rifle with deadly purpose, were now calloused from the handle of a hoe. He spoke only to his horse, a grey mustang he called Ghost, and the words were always in his native Chiricahua tongue. It was on a Tuesday, in late August, when the heat was a physical weight that the silence was broken. Ethan was on his porch sharpening a skinning knife when he saw it, a pillar of dust rising from the east, slow and agonizing. It wasn't the signature of a lone rider or a stagecoach. It was the plume of something heavy and dying. He watched his dark eyes unblinking as the shape slowly resolved itself. A single prairie schooner, its canvas torn, pulled by 2 skeletal oxen that looked ready to collapse. He felt a familiar tightening in his gut. Trouble. Trouble always came covered in dust. He laid the knife down, stood and went inside, emerging a moment later with his 1873 Winchester. He didn't chamber a round, but the weight of it in his hands was a comfort, a link to a past where threats were simpler to understand. The wagon creaked to a halt, 100 yards from his fence line, one of its wheels shattered into a jagged grin. The oxen, their labor done, sagged in their yokes. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the canvas flap was pushed aside, and a woman climbed down. She was tall, with fiery red hair, pulled back in a severe bun, her face smudged with dirt, but her posture unbent by exhaustion. She was followed by 4 others. Ethan watched them, his expression impassive. He saw their forms, but also their stories. The weariness in their shoulders, the tattered state of their mourning dresses, the way they huddled together like quail, sensing a hawk. One of them, a stout woman with a face etched by worry, held a rifle, though she held it awkwardly like a foreign object. Another, younger and frail, seemed to be holding herself up by sheer will. The red-haired woman, clearly the leader, started walking towards his house. Alone. Her steps were deliberate, each one a testament to her resolve. She stopped at the fence gate, her hands gripping the rough wood. "Hello, the house," she called out, her voice raspy from thirst, but clear. Ethan remained on the porch, the Winchester held loosely across his chest. He said nothing. Silence was his shield and his weapon. "My name is Sarah O'Malley," she continued, undeterred. "Our wagon, it's broken. We've been traveling from Clifton, our husbands. They all died in the copper mine collapse 3 weeks ago." Her voice cracked on the last words, but she quickly regained her composure. "We have a boy with us. He's sick. We've been without water since yesterday morning. We saw the green along the creek bed from the ridge. We're begging you for a little water, for shelter until we can figure out what to do." He studied her. He saw no deceit in her eyes, only a bone-deep desperation that resonated with a distant echo in his own soul. Still he did not move. Trust was a currency he had not dealt in for 2 decades. From the wagon, the woman with the rifle shouted, her voice laced with fear and suspicion. "Sarah, come back. You don't know who that is." Sarah O'Malley didn't turn. Her eyes remained locked on Ethan. "Please," she whispered, the word nearly stolen by the wind. "We have nowhere else to go." Ethan's gaze drifted past her to the wagon. He could see the small, pale face of a child peering out from the shadows. The boy couldn't have been more than 7, the same age DeSoda had been when the sickness took him. A memory sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass pierced through his carefully constructed armor, Alape's hand in his. Her voice, a faint whisper. "Promise me you will live. Find the sun again." He had lived, but he had not seen the sun. He had only seen the glare off the baked earth. He let out a slow breath. He lowered the Winchester and leaned it against the adobe wall. With movements that seemed to ache with the effort of breaking a 20-year habit, he walked down the steps across the packed dirt yard and stopped in front of the gate. He didn't open it. He just looked at Sarah O'Malley, his face as unreadable as the stone mesas behind him. "One night," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. "Water and a roof. Then you go." Relief washed over Sarah's face so completely it was as if she might collapse. She nodded, tears finally tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Thank you," she breathed. "God bless you." Ethan merely grunted in response. He didn't believe in her God. He wasn't even sure he believed in his own anymore. He turned and walked towards the well, the creak of the pulley sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. He had let the world in. And as he lowered the bucket into the cool darkness, he had a chilling premonition that the silence of Cinder Creek was now broken for good. Bringing the 5 widows and the boy into the fold of his solitary life was like trying to gentle 5 spooked mares at once. As Ethan worked the pump filling a large wooden trough, the others approached hesitantly from the wagon, a flock of black-clad crows in the shimmering heat. Sarah O'Malley quickly made the introductions, her voice still trembling with gratitude. The woman holding the rifle was Eleanor Vance, widow of a deputy marshal from Silver City. Her eyes narrowed, and mistrustful never left Ethan. She sized him up not as a savior, but as a potential threat, her hand never straying far from the Spencer rifle she carried. The youngest was Clara May Thompson, a slip of a girl who looked barely out of her teens, her face pale and frightened. She had been married for only 6 months before the mine took her Daniel. Next was Isabella Rossi, an Italian immigrant, whose husband Marco had been the mine's engineer. She had a quiet warmth about her, but her dark eyes held a profound sadness. And finally, there was Maria Gonzalez, a woman who seemed to exist only in the shadows. She hadn't spoken a word since her husband, a freighter named Carlos, had also perished. She moved like a phantom, her face hidden behind a black shawl. And then there was the boy, Thomas Sarah's son. His face was flushed with fever, and he leaned heavily against his mother. Ethan listened to the names, but they were just sounds. He saw them for what they were: survivors. And survival was a language he understood. "The barn," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the sturdy, weathered structure 50 yards from the house. "It's clean. Hay is fresh." Eleanor Vance bristled immediately. "The barn like livestock. There's a house right there." Sarah placed a calming hand on her arm. "Eleanor, please. The man is offering us shelter. We'll be grateful for it." She looked at Ethan. "The barn will be fine." "Thank you." Ethan gave a curt nod. The house was his sanctuary, the repository of his memories of Apache and Dasoda. The idea of strangers sleeping under its roof, filling it with their voices and their sorrows, was unbearable. The barn was a compromise. For the rest of the afternoon, a strange, tense ballet unfolded. Ethan, true to his word, provided water and pointed them towards a fire pit. He gave them a side of venison jerky and a sack of cornmeal from his stores, his actions efficient and detached. He then retreated to the far side of his property, ostensibly to check on his cattle, but really to put distance between himself and the sudden intrusion. From a low ridge, he watched them. Sarah, the natural leader, immediately began to organize. She dispatched Clara May to fetch more water, and tried to coax Maria into helping with little success. Isabella, upon seeing the feverish Thomas, began searching the creek bed, her brow furrowed in concentration. Eleanor, meanwhile, took up a sentry position near the broken wagon, her rifle across her lap, her suspicious gaze sweeping across the landscape and returning always to Ethan's distant figure. The tension was thick enough to cut. Eleanor's prejudice was a palpable thing. To her, Ethan was no different from the renegades her husband had hunted. She saw his silence not as solitude, but as menace. Her fear made her sharp-tongued. "I don't like this, Sarah," she muttered as they tried to make a crude camp near the barn, living on an Indian's charity. "We don't know what he wants. He wants to be left alone." "That's what he wants," Sarah retorted, her patience fraying. "And right now he's giving us what we need to survive. Water, food, a place to rest. Is your pride worth more than Thomas's life that silenced Eleanor for a time?" As evening bled across the sky, painting the mesas in hues of orange and purple, Isabella returned from the creek. She clutched a handful of willow bark and some broad-leafed plants. She found Ethan by the corral checking the latch. She approached him cautiously. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her Italian accent softening her words. Ethan turned his face, impassive. "My boy, Thomas. His fever is high," Isabella explained, holding up the leaves. "In my country, we use these for teas to break the fever. But this bark, willow, I have heard it is strong medicine." "Is this true?" Ethan looked at the bark in her hand. He recognized it instantly. His own people had used it for generations to treat pain and fever. He looked at Isabella's face, at the genuine knowledge and concern in her eyes. It was the first time one of them had spoken to him about something other than their own needs. They had spoken of the land. Yes, he said the single word, carrying weight. "It is strong medicine. Boil it in water. Give the boy a little to drink." He then paused and added, "Crush these," pointing to a small, dusty green plant growing near the corral fence. "Make a paste. Put it on his forehead. It will draw out the heat." Isabella's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. "Grazie." "Thank you." She hurried away. The small exchange did not go unnoticed. From her post, Eleanor saw it her suspicion twisting it into something sinister. A witch doctor giving strange herbs to a sick child. Later that night, the smell of a meager cornmeal stew and the willow bark tea drifted from the women's campfire. Ethan sat on his own porch, eating a piece of jerky, the distance between them, feeling both vast and terrifyingly small. He could hear their murmured conversation, the occasional fretful cry from the boy. It was a phantom echo of the life he had once known, a cruel reminder of the family that had been stolen from him. The sound was a torment, and yet it was also the first human sound to grace his ranch in years that wasn't his own lonely breathing. The first sign of the greater threat came 2 days later. The women's one night had stretched into 2 as they struggled to devise a plan. Their wagon was beyond their ability to repair, and the nearest town, Jericho Fork, was a good 40 miles on foot, an impossible journey with a sick child and no supplies. They were trapped. Ethan had tolerated their presence with a stoic resignation, keeping his distance, but ensuring they didn't starve. He was chopping wood when he saw the riders, 2 of them approaching from the north. They weren't cowboys. They rode with a swaggering arrogance, their gear expensive, their horses too fine for simple ranch hands. He stopped his work resting the axe and watched them. Eleanor, ever vigilant, saw them too and quickly raised her rifle. The men reined in their horses a short distance away, their eyes sweeping over the ranch, taking in Ethan, the broken-down wagon, and the women clustered near the barn. One of the men, a burly individual with a cruel mouth and a dusty bowler hat, smirked. "Well now, Jeb," he said to his partner, "look what we have here. The old Apache's gone and got himself a harem." The man, named Jeb Lena, and with cold, dead eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Mr. Blackwood ain't gonna like this. He wants this land quiet. Doesn't like complications." They stared for another minute, their insolent gaze a clear message of intimidation, before turning their horses and riding off. They never spoke a word to Ethan or the women, but their message had been delivered. After they were gone, Sarah walked over to Ethan, her face pale. Who were they? Ethan looked at the dust they left behind, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. He knew men like that. They were vultures circling what they believed was already dead. "They work for Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice flat. "He owns the Rocking Bee, the big ranch to the north. He wants all the water in this valley. That means he wants Cinder Creek. That means he wants this land." Eleanor lowered her rifle, a new kind of fear dawning on her face. She had been so focused on the perceived threat from Ethan, she had failed to see the real danger approaching from the outside. "And what does that mean for us?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan picked up his axe and slammed it into the chopping block. He looked at the 5 widows, their faces a mixture of fear and uncertainty. They were no longer just a burden. Their presence had made his ranch a complication. "It means," he said grimly, "that you brought more trouble than just a broken wheel." The visit from Blackwood's men was a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples of unease spread quickly. The women's predicament was no longer simply about being stranded. They were now potential obstacles in a rich man's path. The tense quiet between them and Ethan began to shift subtly, replaced by the shared awareness of a common enemy. Silas Blackwood did not wait long to make his presence known directly. A week after his men had scouted the ranch, he arrived himself. He rode a magnificent black stallion and was dressed in a tailored suit of charcoal gray that seemed absurdly out of place in the dusty landscape. He was a man in his 50s, with a neatly trimmed silver beard, a politician's smile, and the eyes of a predator. He was flanked by the same 2 men, Jeb Stone and his partner. Ethan was mending a fence when they rode up. The women who were washing clothes by the creek froze, then slowly gathered behind the relative safety of the barn. Sarah held Thomas close, while Eleanor, ever the guardian, held her rifle, though she kept it pointed at the ground. "Good morning." Blackwood boomed, his voice smooth and commanding. He dismounted with practiced ease. "Silas Blackwood, your neighbor to the north." He extended a gloved hand towards Ethan. Ethan ignored the hand. He simply stood, his hammer dangling from his grip, his face an impassive mask. Blackwood's smile didn't falter. He let his hand drop. "I see you've had some visitors." His gaze swept over the women, lingering on them with an oily appraisal that made Sarah's skin crawl. A charitable act, taking in these poor unfortunates. A truly Christian thing to do. The way he said Christian was a subtle dig, a reminder of the chasm between their worlds. They needed water. Ethan said, his voice low. "Ah, the water," Blackwood said, turning his attention to the creek. "Yes, Cinder Creek, the lifeblood of this valley, a precious commodity. Which is why I'm here." He turned back to Ethan, his smile vanishing, replaced by a look of shrewd business. "I'll be direct. Your parcel of land is modest, difficult to work, and frankly, you're sitting on the most valuable spring for 50 miles. I want it. I'm prepared to offer you $500. Cash. More than this dusty patch is worth. You could take the money move to a reservation with more of your kind. Be more comfortable." $500 was a fortune, more money than the women had ever seen in one place. But Ethan didn't even blink. This land was more than dirt and rock to him. It was the place he had come to bury his past. It was where he had honored the promise to his dying wife. The graves of his ancestors were not here, but his soul was interred in this soil. "The land is not for sale," Ethan stated flatly. Blackwood's veneer of civility cracked, his eyes hardened. "Everything is for sale, my friend. It's just a matter of price. Perhaps you don't understand your position. You're one man. An old Indian on a plot of land the government forgot it even gave away. I, on the other hand, have resources. I have friends in Prescott. I have the law in my pocket. A piece of paper from a forgotten treaty won't stand up to progress." He took a step closer, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial, threatening whisper. "And now you have these women. Complications, dependents, they make you vulnerable. Accidents can happen out here. A stray spark to a dry barn. Cattle that wander off. A well that suddenly goes foul. It would be a tragedy for these poor widows to suffer another loss so soon." The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the air like poison. It was directed at Ethan, but it encompassed all of them. From behind the barn, Eleanor's knuckles were white on the stock of her rifle. This man, with his fine clothes and smooth words, was more dangerous than any outlaw she had ever imagined. Ethan's jaw tightened. For a moment, a flicker of the old warrior, the man who had fought beside Geronimo, sparked in his eyes. He could smell the evil on this man, the rot beneath the expensive cologne. "You have my answer," Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Leave my land." Blackwood stared at him for a long, silent moment, the friendly mask gone completely. What was left was cold, ruthless ambition. "A pity," he said, turning to remount his horse. I tried to be reasonable. He settled into his saddle and looked down at Ethan. "You have 1 week to reconsider my offer. After that, the offer is withdrawn, and I can't be responsible for what might happen." With a final contemptuous look at the women, he spurred his horse and rode away, his henchmen falling in behind him. The dust settled, leaving an atmosphere of dread. The illusion of safety, however fragile it had been, was shattered. They were no longer just stranded. They were under siege. That evening, the mood around the campfire was somber. For the first time, all 6 of them sat together, including Ethan. He didn't join their circle but sat on a nearby rock, close enough to hear a silent, brooding presence. "What are we going to do?" Clara May whispered, her voice trembling. "He'll do what he said. He'll drive us out. Or worse." "We can't stay here," Eleanor insisted, her earlier mistrust of Ethan now wholly transferred to Blackwood. "We're putting this man in danger. We have to leave." And go where Eleanor Sarah countered her voice, weary but firm. "Walk to Jericho Fork with a sick child and no provisions. We'd die in the desert. Blackwood knows that. He's counting on it. He's trapped us here." Isabella looked over at Ethan, who was staring into the fire, his face grim. "This is your home," she said softly. "He is trying to steal your home." Ethan looked up, his gaze meeting hers. He then looked at each of the women and at the boy Thomas, who was now sleeping fitfully, his fever having finally broken, thanks to Isabella's willow bark tea. He saw their fear, but he also saw a flicker of defiance. They were like him, pushed to the edge with nowhere left to run. He thought of Blackwood's words. "They make you vulnerable." The man was wrong. Blackwood thought they were a weakness, but perhaps they were something else, entirely. Ethan finally spoke, his voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. "He thinks I am one old man. He thinks you are 5 helpless women. The desert teaches you to see things as they are. A single coyote is a scavenger. A pack is a hunter." He stood up, his tall frame silhouetted against the flames. "This land was paid for. Not with money, but with the blood and ghosts of my people. I will not give it to a man like him." He looked directly at Sarah. "You asked for shelter. As long as you are here, you are under the protection of this house. If you run, you will die. If you stay, you must fight." A profound silence fell over the small group. He wasn't just offering them shelter anymore. He was offering them a choice, an alliance. He was Ethan the warrior, awakening from a long slumber. Sarah O'Malley looked at the faces of her companions, Eleanor's newfound resolve, Isabella's quiet strength, Clara May's terror warring with a tiny spark of hope, and even Maria, who was watching Ethan with an unreadable intensity. She then looked at her sleeping son, the reason for all of this. She stood and faced Ethan. "We are not warriors," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We are widows, we are mothers, but we will not run. We will stay. Tell us how to fight." In that moment, under a blanket of stars in the vast Arizona wilderness, an impossible pact was sealed. The solitary Apache and the 5 desperate widows were no longer separate entities. They were a pack, and they were about to show Silas Blackwood what it meant to hunt on their own territory. The week that followed Silas Blackwood's ultimatum transformed the Cinder Creek Ranch. The lethargy of despair was replaced by the thrum of purposeful activity. Ethan, shaking off the rust of his long solitude, became a reluctant teacher, and the widows, driven by the primal need to protect their newfound sanctuary, became his unlikely students. A new family forged in mutual peril was being born. The lessons began at dawn. Ethan's methods were stark and practical, stripped of pleasantries. He started with Eleanor. He'd seen the way she held her Spencer rifle with familiarity, but with the rigid posture of someone taught on a firing line, not in a real fight. "You shoot like a soldier," he told her one morning, leading her out to a series of rock formations. "A soldier stands in a line. The land is not a line. It has teeth. It hides. You must hide with it." He spent hours with her, not just on aim, but on awareness. He taught her to read the wind by the drift of a milkweed seed, to use the shadows of the morning sun for cover to become part of the landscape. He showed her how to track, pointing out the nearly invisible signs of a coyote's passing, the subtle disturbance in the dirt that marked a man's boot print. Eleanor, the lawman's widow, absorbed it all with a grim intensity. Her respect for Ethan grew with every lesson, her former prejudice burning away under the harsh desert sun, like a morning mist. For Sarah, the lessons were in strategy and resources. Ethan walked the perimeter of his land, with her showing her the weak points in the fences, the natural choke points in the canyons, the hidden game trails that could be used as escape routes or ambush points. Blackwood thinks in terms of men and guns, he explained, pointing to a narrow wash leading from the creek. He will come from the road. He will not expect an attack from the rocks above or a trap in the wash below. He taught her how to ration their precious food, which plants were edible, which springs were reliable, and how to read the clouds for the promise of rain. She became the quartermaster and strategist of their small army. Isabella, with her innate knowledge of plants, became Ethan's apprentice in the deeper arts of the desert. He showed her not just the herbs for healing, like the one that had helped Thomas, but also those for other purposes. He pointed out the stinging nettle that could be woven into strong cord, the yucca root that could be pulped into a sleep-inducing poison for small game traps, and the pungent creosote bush whose smoke could be used for signals. A bond of quiet, mutual respect formed between the Apache warrior and the Italian healer, a shared understanding that the earth provided all that was needed for both life and death. Even young, timid Clara May found her role. Terrified of firearms, she had a keen eye and a steady hand. Ethan gave her the task of Fletcher. He showed her how to straighten arrow shafts from desert willow, how to knap shards of obsidian into sharp points, and how to bind hawk feathers for guidance. Working with her hands seemed to calm her nerves, and she meticulously crafted a small supply of silent, deadly arrows for a bow Ethan had kept wrapped in buckskin for 20 years. The most profound change, however, began to stir in Maria Gonzalez. The silent widow who had existed like a ghost among them started to watch. Her dark, haunted eyes followed Ethan everywhere. She observed his silent movements, the way he seemed to blend into the landscape, a man who was part of the earth itself. She saw in his solitude a reflection of her own profound, isolating grief. One afternoon, Ethan was checking a series of snares he had set for rabbits. He came to one and found it empty, the trigger stone disturbed. He knelt, studying the ground, and saw the faint, almost imperceptible tracks of a bobcat. As he rose, he found Maria standing just a few feet away. She had approached so silently he hadn't heard her. She pointed a trembling finger at the tracks. "Gato," she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken in weeks. Cat. Ethan looked from the tracks to her face. He saw a flicker of life in her eyes that had not been there before. He simply nodded. Yes. Gato. From that day on, she began to shadow him on his patrols, never speaking, but watching, learning. Her silence, once a symptom of her trauma, was becoming a skill. She noticed things the others missed, a loose rock on a high trail, the nervous flight of a sparrow that signaled a hidden presence. She was becoming their eyes, but it was a near tragedy that truly cemented their bond. Thomas, now recovered from his fever, was a typical 7-year-old boy, full of curiosity and heedless of danger. While the women were occupied, he wandered from the barn, chasing a lizard down towards the creek bed. He reached under a rocky overhang, just as a large western diamondback, coiled in the shade, struck out. The boy's scream ripped through the air. Everyone converged on the spot in a panic. Thomas was clutching his hand, 2 small puncture wounds, already beginning to swell and discolor. The snake was gone. While Sarah descended into hysterics and Eleanor ran for the whiskey, believing it to be a cure, Ethan and Isabella sprang into action with a chilling synchronicity. "Hold him still," Ethan commanded, his voice a sharp crack of authority that cut through the panic. Isabella was already on her knees, cradling the terrified, sobbing boy, speaking to him in soothing Italian. Ethan pulled his skinning knife. Without hesitation, he made 2 small, shallow cuts over the bite marks, just enough to break the skin. He then put his mouth over the wound and began to suck, spitting the blood and venom onto the dirt. It was an old, dangerous technique, but it was all they had. While he worked, he barked orders. Clara, the fire. A piece of metal in the flames. Now Eleanor, get the rope from the barn. Tie it above his elbow, not too tight. His commands, born of a lifetime of surviving the desert's perils, galvanized them. Each woman moved to her task. Clara May stoked the fire, her hands surprisingly steady. Eleanor returned with the rope. Sarah, seeing the focused intensity, choked back her sobs and helped Isabella hold her son. After drawing what venom he could, Ethan cauterized the wound with the glowing hot tip of a metal file from his toolkit. Thomas screamed once more, a raw cry of pain before mercifully fainting. "He is not dead," Ethan said, breathing heavily, his face pale with the effort and the poison he had surely ingested. Now the work begins. For the next 2 days, the ranch house, Ethan's sacrosanct space, became a hospital. He had carried the boy inside without a second thought, laying him on his own cot. The barrier between his world and theirs had dissolved in the face of a child suffering. He and Isabella worked side by side. Ethan prepared poultices of crushed desert marigold and clay to draw out the swelling, while Isabella brewed teas from echinacea and other plants she recognized, forcing the liquid drop by drop between Thomas's lips to fight the fever and poison from within. The other women took turns sitting with him, bathing his forehead and praying. On the 3rd morning, Thomas's eyes fluttered open. His first word was a weak croaked. Mama Sarah burst into tears of relief, hugging her son gently. The crisis had passed. Later that day, Eleanor Vance found Ethan sitting on his porch, staring out at the mesas. He looked exhausted. She stood beside him, her Spencer rifle held loosely in her hand. "You saved him," she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan didn't look at her. "We saved him. My husband, Eleanor," said her voice, quiet and thick with emotion. "He spent years fighting men like you. He used to tell me stories. He called your people savages." She paused, swallowing hard. "He was a good man, but he was wrong. I was wrong." Ethan finally turned his head to look at her. He saw the shame and the sincere regret in her eyes. He saw a bridge being built over a chasm of hatred and misunderstanding. He gave a slow, solemn nod. "Many good men were wrong," he said. "The shared danger, the shared purpose, and now the shared victory over death had changed them. They were no longer a man and 5 widows. They were a family, as strange and patched together as any on the frontier." And as they watched the sun set that evening, they knew that Silas Blackwood wasn't just coming for a piece of land anymore. He was coming for their home. The 1-week deadline from Silas Blackwood passed into a tense, watchful silence. The storm broke not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet theft of their future. Ethan rode out one morning to find his fence cut and his entire herd of 30 longhorns gone driven north towards the rocking bee. He returned not with words, but with a grim set to his jaw that spoke volumes. Blackwood was trying to starve them out, to bleed them dry, without firing a shot. But despair was a luxury they could not afford. That evening, Ethan spread a map Sarah had drawn on a piece of hide. "He thinks like a white man," Ethan said, his voice a low rumble. "He understands fences and ownership. He does not understand the land. their response would not be a direct assault, but a strike from the shadows, using the desert itself as their weapon. Their target was Blackwood's weekly supply wagon from Jericho Fork, his lifeline of whiskey flour and ammunition. 2 nights later, Ethan, Eleanor, and Sarah moved under the cover of a new moon, following game trails to a narrow canyon miles away. They worked for hours, positioning a series of boulders on a ledge above the trail, held in place by a single cleverly rigged rope. It was a deadfall trap on a massive scale. As dawn streaked the sky, they heard the rumble of the wagon. Concealed in the rocks, they waited. When the wagon entered the bottleneck, a signal the call of a cactus wren from Maria, their lookout echoed in the canyon. Now Ethan whispered. He and Sarah pulled, and a cascade of rock and dirt thundered down, blocking the path completely. From her perch, Eleanor fired 2 precise shots from her Spencer rifle, shattering the wagon's front axle. The heavy vehicle collapsed, spilling its contents. The 2 drivers panicked and, confused, fired blindly into the cliffs as the attackers melted back into the landscape. They had sent their message. We are not helpless prey. Blackwood's reply was swift and vicious. He sent his cruel foreman, Jeb Stone, with 4 men, not to fight, but to destroy. Their target was the heart of the ranch. But they were seen. Maria, their silent sentinel on the ridges, spotted them miles out and raced back to give the alarm. 5 riders, she gasped, from the north. Fast. There was no time for an elaborate defense. To the house, Ethan commanded. Bring the water in. They scrambled, hauling barrels of their precious water into the thick-walled adobe home. Eleanor took an upstairs window, Ethan the other, while Sarah barred the door. Jeb Stone's men thundered into the yard. Blackwood gave you a chance, Apache. Jeb bellowed. 2 of his men ran for the well with large sacks. Now you'll die of thirst. The sacks, Ethan said calmly to Eleanor. Not the men. 2 rifles cracked as one. Both sacks were torn open, spilling a foul white powder, lie harmlessly into the dirt. Enraged Stone's men opened fire, their bullets thudding impotently against the adobe walls. The standoff was a tense exchange of fire when a rider broke from cover, trying for a better angle near the barn. From the hayloft window, a silent arrow arced through the air, striking the man's horse in the flank. The animal shrieked and bucked, throwing its rider. Clara May, her face pale but her eyes blazing, had joined the fight. The silent, unseen attack unnerved them. This wasn't the fight they'd signed up for. Realizing his mission had failed, Jeb Stone gave the order to pull back. "We'll be back," he screamed, his voice thick with hate. "We'll burn you out." They galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a promise of escalating violence. The first strikes were over. The real war was about to begin. The air after Jeb Stone's threat was heavy, and still the calm of a held breath. They knew Blackwood would return, not to intimidate, but to annihilate. Ethan turned the ranch into a fortress. They reinforced the adobe house, dug shallow rifle pits behind the corral, and stockpiled water and supplies. Every action was imbued with a sense of finality. Maria became their eyes, spending her days on the high ridges, watching. The attack came at dawn on the 4th day. Maria slipped into the barn where the others slept. "They come," she whispered urgently. "Many men. 10, maybe 12. From the north and from the west canyon." Blackwood was flanking them. "To your places," Ethan's voice was a steady anchor. "Do not fire until they are in the yard." In the grey morning light they moved. Sarah took Thomas to the root cellar with Isabella, who had turned it into an infirmary, before taking her own post at a firing slit. Clara May climbed to the barn's hayloft with her bow. Eleanor and Ethan manned the upstairs windows. Maria, her scouting done, armed herself with a heavy skillet and a knife, melting into the barn's deepest shadows. The drumming of hooves grew louder. 8 men, led by Blackwood and Jeb Stone, rode brazenly into the yard. 4 others circled west towards the barn. Ethan Blackwood bellowed, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Your time is up. Send out the women." The only answer was silence. "Fine," he snarled. "Burn it." As 2 men with torches advanced, Ethan's voice cut the air. "Now!" The yard erupted. Ethan's Winchester dropped one torchbearer. Eleanor's Spencer took the other. Blackwood's men scrambled for cover as a storm of well-aimed fire rained down. From the hayloft, Clara May's arrows flew silent and deadly, sowing confusion. An arrow took 1 man in the shoulder, a second felled another. But the flanking group had reached the barn. They kicked the doors in, expecting to find cowering women. The first man through was met with the sickening crunch of Maria's cast-iron skillet against his skull. The second stared in shock as Maria stood before him, knife in hand. He never saw Jeb Stone step up behind her. A single shot echoed inside the barn. Maria stumbled out into the yard, a bloody gash on her arm, with Stone grinning triumphantly behind her. "Got one of them, boss," he yelled. But in his moment of triumph, he had forgotten the shadows. From the side door of the barn, Sarah O'Malley appeared, having circled around from the house. "For my husband," she screamed, firing her pistol. The bullet struck Jeb Stone in the back, and he pitched forward into the dirt. The foreman's death broke the attackers' morale. Seeing their leader fall, 2 more men fled. Blackwood, now with only 2 men, was trapped and enraged. "I'll kill you all," he shrieked. Ethan had been waiting. "Eleanor, keep them pinned," he ordered, and slipped away from the window. Moving with the silence of a ghost, he used the trenches they'd dug to circle behind the battle. He rose from the earth like an avenging spirit right behind Blackwood's position. He disabled 1 man with the butt of his rifle. The last surrendered when a bullet from Eleanor's window kicked his pistol from his hand. Now only 2 men remained, Ethan and Silas Blackwood. Blackwood stared, his civilized veneer stripped away to reveal a cornered animal. He raised his revolver, but Ethan was faster. He didn't shoot. He lunged, twisting the gun from Blackwood's hand. They grappled in the dirt, a desperate struggle of strength and will. Ethan finally overpowered the larger man, pinning him with the point of a skinning knife pressed to his throat. Blackwood froze, his eyes wide with terror. "This land has teeth," Ethan whispered, the desire for vengeance a hot fire in his blood. He could end it all right there. But then the women emerged from their positions, their faces smudged with gunpowder, their eyes shining with fierce triumph. He looked from the terrified man beneath him to the faces of his new family, Sarah Eleanor, Isabella, Clara May, and a wounded but defiant Maria. They had won. Together. The warrior's fire in his soul cooled. He had a choice to feed the ghosts of his past or build a future with the family he had just bled to protect. Slowly, with a shuddering breath, he pulled the knife away. The siege of Cinder Creek was over. The rising sun illuminated a yard scarred by battle, but filled with a profound, victorious quiet. 3 of Blackwood's men were dead. The rest, including a humiliated Silas Blackwood, were bound prisoners. Maria's arm was being expertly stitched by Isabella. The cost had been high, but they had held their home. There was no celebration, only a shared, bone-deep exhaustion and a sense of grim purpose. They knew this victory would only last if it was sanctioned by the law they stood outside of. The deputy in Jericho Fork, John Riley Sarah, stated he was a friend of Eleanor's husband. "He's an honest man." It was settled. Eleanor, the lawman's widow, would escort the prisoners to town and bring back the law. Before she left, she stood beside Ethan, gazing at the defeated Blackwood. "You should have killed him," she said quietly. "It would have been justice." Ethan watched the morning light touch the mesas. "Vengeance is a fire that burns the one who holds it," he replied. "My life has had enough fire. Today is for building." Eleanor looked at him, a deep and final understanding passing between them, and then she rode east, leaving the ranch in a state of watchful peace. The week that followed was one of healing. They repaired the bullet-scarred walls, patched the barn door, and buried the dead. The physical work of rebuilding their home helped mend their spirits. Maria began to speak more freely, her voice reclaiming its place in the world. Clara May, having found her courage, radiated a new confidence. They were no longer just survivors. They were homesteaders, their bond forged in the crucible of combat. Eleanor returned with Deputy Riley and a U.S. Marshal in tow. The lawmen listened to their story, surveyed the evidence, and took statements. With the testimony of one of Blackwood's own men, the case was sealed. Silas Blackwood was taken away in irons to face federal charges. For once, the law had protected the just. That evening, the 6 of them gathered on the porch of the adobe house. The air was cool and clean. The scars on the ranch were no longer wounds, but proof of their resilience. Sarah O'Malley, speaking for them all, turned to Ethan. "We owe you everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But we can't live on your charity forever. We've saved a little. We want to buy a piece of this land from you, to build our own cabin, to be your neighbors." Ethan looked at the 5 women and the boy playing nearby. He looked at the life that now filled the spaces once occupied by ghosts and silence. This was no longer just his sanctuary. It was their home. A rare, small smile touched his lips as he slowly shook his head. "This land is not for sale," he said. Seeing their crestfallen faces, he waited a moment before delivering the final truth. "You do not buy land from family." He gestured with an open hand to the house, the creek and the valley beyond. "Our home is large enough." Tears of gratitude welled in Sarah's eyes. A profound, unbreakable bond settled over them. Ethan, the solitary warrior, was no longer alone. He had lost one family to the tragedies of the past, but here against all odds, he had found another. A new dawn had finally come to Cinder Creek. The story of Ethan and the widows of Cinder Creek isn't just a tale of survival against all odds. It's a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. It shows us that family isn't always the one you're born into, but the one you forge in the fires of adversity. They were broken individuals, from different worlds, united by loss, who found strength, courage, and a new beginning in each other. Their home was built not just with adobe and wood, but with loyalty, respect, and the fierce determination to protect what they held dear. If this story of resilience and the birth of an unlikely American family moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a powerful story from the forgotten corners of the Wild West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more true-to-life tales of grit, courage, and the untold history of the frontier waiting to be shared. Thank you for listening.